"Is that really the gift?" my son-in-law asked, laughing loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. A few people chuckled with him. Someone nearly dropped a fork, trying not to laugh. I simply smiled and folded my hands in my lap. 3 days earlier, I had removed him from my $2 million will. Jason Bennett thought he understood the value of things. He always measured worth by price tags, square footage, and investment returns. That was why he looked so amused standing in the middle of his 47th birthday party, holding the small wooden box I had spent weeks preparing. The party was being held at a country club just outside Hartford, Connecticut. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. Waiters moved quietly between tables carrying trays of appetizers. A jazz trio played softly near the windows overlooking the golf course. It was the sort of event Jason loved. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked impressive. My daughter Laura had organized the celebration down to the smallest detail. The floral arrangements matched the napkins. The cake stood nearly 3 feet tall. Even the custom cocktail menu featured drinks named after Jason's business achievements. I sat near the back of the room and watched it all unfold. At 72 years old, I had attended enough family gatherings to recognize when someone enjoyed being the center of attention. Jason practically lived for it. "Come on," he said, lifting the wooden box higher. "Maybe there's a sports car key hidden inside." More laughter followed. I noticed Laura smiling nervously beside him. She glanced toward me for a moment before looking away. The box itself wasn't fancy. It was handcrafted walnut, polished by hand, with brass hinges worn smooth from age. My late husband had built it more than 30 years ago in the workshop behind our first house. Back then we had very little money. We measured success differently. We celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes and handwritten cards. We treasured things because of the memories attached to them, not because they appeared in luxury catalogs. Jason carefully opened the lid. His smile faded slightly. Inside was an old pocket watch, resting on dark blue velvet. For a brief second, the room grew quiet. Then Jason laughed again. "A watch," he said. "You had me expecting something bigger." The guests laughed politely. Some looked uncomfortable. Others stared into their drinks. I felt no anger. Surprisingly, I felt nothing at all. That reaction had already happened a week earlier when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Tonight simply confirmed what I already knew. Jason turned the watch over in his hand. "Does it even work?" he asked. "It does," I answered calmly. "It belonged to Richard." My husband's name hung in the air for a moment. Richard Carter had been gone for almost 6 years, yet many people in that room still remembered him. He had built a successful construction company from the ground up and spent decades helping friends, employees, and family members. The watch had rarely left his pocket. "Well," Jason said with a shrug, "I guess vintage is making a comeback." More scattered laughter followed. I smiled again. That seemed to confuse him. He expected embarrassment. He expected disappointment. Instead, I simply watched him. Across the room, my granddaughter Emma caught my eye. Unlike the others, she wasn't laughing. She looked at the watch. Then she looked at me. Something in her expression told me she understood that this moment wasn't really about a gift. It was about character. Jason slipped the watch back into the box and handed it to a waiter as though it were an afterthought. The room moved on. Conversations resumed. Music filled the silence. Glasses clinked. Nobody noticed the chapter that had quietly ended. Nobody except me. And while Jason stood surrounded by friends, business partners, and family members, basking in attention, he remained completely unaware that the future he had counted on for years had already disappeared. The party continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Guests drifted from table to table. The band moved into a slower set. Outside the tall windows, the last light of evening settled across the golf course. I remained in my chair for a while, watching people celebrate a man who believed success could be measured entirely by what appeared on a balance sheet. Years ago, I might have felt hurt by what happened. That version of me would have spent the drive home replaying every laugh and every careless remark. But grief changes a person. Losing Richard had taught me that some things deserve your energy and some things do not. By the time I left the country club that evening, my thoughts were not on Jason at all. They were on a small workshop that no longer existed. Richard built that walnut box during the first year of our marriage. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom house then. The roof leaked when it rained. The furnace failed every winter. We counted every dollar. Yet those years remained among the happiest of my life. Richard believed that objects carried stories. He would spend hours repairing an old chair rather than buying a new one. He kept handwritten notes tucked inside books. He saved ticket stubs from road trips. He treated memories as treasures. The pocket watch had been one of his favorite possessions. Every morning, he slipped it into his pocket before leaving for work. Every evening, he placed it on the dresser beside our bed. When he passed away, I could barely look at it. For months, it remained untouched inside a drawer. Then one afternoon, Emma asked about it. She was 13 at the time. Unlike most teenagers, she genuinely loved listening to family stories. She sat beside me for nearly 2 hours while I told her about the watch, the workshop, and the early years of our marriage. She held the watch carefully, almost reverently. I remember thinking then that she understood something many adults never learn. She understood that value and price are not the same thing. The memory returned as I drove home through the Connecticut countryside. The roads were quiet. Streetlights reflected across the windshield. My phone remained silent. No apology arrived. No message from Laura appeared. That did not surprise me. Laura often found herself caught between loyalty and convenience. She loved me. I never doubted that. But confronting Jason was something she rarely chose to do. When I reached home, I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and looked around the empty house. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt honest. I made a cup of tea and sat beside the window Richard loved. The moonlight stretched across the backyard. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the darkness. My thoughts drifted back to a conversation I had overheard the previous week. A conversation that explained everything. At the time, I had arrived early for a family barbecue. No one realized I was standing near the side patio when Jason began speaking with two of his friends. His voice carried clearly through the open screen door. I remember every word because those words quietly changed the course of my future. That afternoon was the moment I stopped asking whether I had been imagining the disrespect. It was the moment I finally understood exactly how Jason saw me and exactly what he believed he was entitled to receive. I stood near the patio for several seconds before anyone realized I had arrived. The afternoon sun spilled across the backyard. Someone was tending a grill. Children were running through the grass. It looked like every ordinary family gathering we had shared over the years. Then I heard Jason laugh. Not the polite laugh he used around clients or neighbors. This one was different. Relaxed. Careless. Honest. "One day that money will be ours anyway," he said. One of his friends chuckled. "You sound pretty confident." Jason took a sip from his drink. "Come on. She is 72. The house, the investments, all of it eventually ends up in the family." Something inside me became very still. I remained where I was, hidden by the corner of the patio. "Maybe," another man said. "That is not how inheritance always works." Jason laughed again. "Trust me, Laura would never let that happen. Besides, Evelyn barely spends anything. She lives like it is still 1985. More laughter followed. The conversation drifted to other topics after that, but I never forgot those words. Not because of the money, because of the assumption behind them. Richard and I had spent nearly 50 years building a life together. We worked weekends. We skipped vacations when the business needed help. We sacrificed comforts to create security. Yet standing there, listening to Jason speak, I realized he viewed everything Richard and I built as something waiting to be collected. Not earned, not respected, collected. The barbecue continued normally after that. I greeted everyone. I smiled for photographs. I complimented the food. Nobody noticed anything had changed. But on the drive home, I found myself replaying small moments from the past few years. Moments I had dismissed at the time. Jason rolling his eyes when I talked about family traditions. Jason joking that my house would make a great renovation project one day. Jason interrupting me whenever conversations turned to finances or business. None of those moments seemed serious on their own. Together, they formed a pattern, like puzzle pieces finally fitting into place. The following morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. I wrote down every person currently listed in my will. Then I wrote down something else. Not what they might inherit, what they contributed to my life. The difference was striking. Some names were attached to kindness, some to loyalty, some to years of genuine connection. One name stood apart. I stared at Jason's name for a long time. I tried to be fair. I tried to imagine Richard sitting across from me. He had always encouraged patience. He believed people deserved second chances. But even Richard believed character mattered. By lunchtime, I had made a decision. Not an emotional one, a practical one. The next day, I called Thomas Reed, the attorney who had handled our estate planning for years. His assistant scheduled an appointment for Friday morning. When I hung up the phone, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Relief. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt as though I was acting instead of simply reacting. Outside the kitchen window, a light breeze moved through the maple trees. I watched the branches sway gently and thought about the future. Jason believed he already knew how that future would unfold. He could not have been more mistaken. Thomas Reed had occupied the same corner office for nearly 20 years. The building overlooked the Connecticut River, and every time I visited, the view seemed unchanged. Boats drifted across the water. People hurried along the sidewalks below. Life moved forward whether anyone was ready or not. When I arrived for my appointment that Friday morning, Thomas greeted me with the same calm professionalism he had always shown. He had worked closely with Richard and me for years. He knew our history. He knew how carefully we planned. After a few minutes of conversation, he opened my file and adjusted his glasses. "What would you like to review today, Evelyn?" he asked. I looked at the folder resting on his desk. For a moment, I thought about Richard. He had always taken these meetings seriously. He believed that responsible planning was one final way to care for the people you loved. "I want to make a change," I said. Thomas nodded without surprise. Clients updated their wills all the time. Children married. Families grew. Circumstances changed. He slid several documents across the desk and began reviewing the current structure of my estate. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, the charitable donations Richard and I had planned together years earlier. Everything appeared exactly as I remembered. Yet as Thomas spoke, I found myself paying less attention to numbers and more attention to meaning. Wealth had never been the point. Richard understood that. The purpose of inheritance was not reward. It was trust. It was placing something valuable into the hands of people who would honor it. "Are you certain about this change?" Thomas asked after I explained my decision. His tone carried no judgment, only caution. "Yes," I answered. "I am." He studied me for a second. "Then I will prepare the revisions." The meeting lasted less than an hour. There were forms to sign, pages to review, legal language to confirm. Nothing dramatic happened. No speeches, no emotional declarations. Just a series of signatures made with a steady hand. When it was finished, Thomas closed the folder. "Everything is updated," he said. I thanked him and stood to leave. Before I reached the door, he spoke again. "Richard always admired your judgment." I paused. "Did he?" Thomas smiled slightly. "More than you know." The drive home felt strangely peaceful. The sky was bright. Early autumn leaves had begun appearing along the roadsides. Gold and crimson patches spread through the trees. I rolled down the window and let the cool air fill the car. For the first time since overhearing that conversation at the barbecue, my thoughts felt settled. The decision was no longer sitting in front of me, waiting to be made. It was done, finished, real. Over the next few days, life continued normally. Laura called to discuss weekend plans. Emma sent me photographs from college. Bills arrived in the mail. Groceries needed buying. Nothing on the surface had changed. Yet beneath those ordinary routines, a quiet shift had occurred. One person believed the future belonged to him. One person assumed certain doors would always remain open. He continued moving through life with complete confidence. He never imagined those doors had already closed. And as the date of his birthday celebration approached, I began to wonder how long confidence could survive when it was built upon an assumption instead of gratitude. The week after the documents were updated passed quietly. That was the strange thing about major decisions. From the outside, life often looked exactly the same. Every morning, I watered the flowers near the front porch. Every afternoon, I answered a few emails, paid a few bills, and read for an hour in the living room. The clocks continued ticking. The sun continued rising and setting. Yet beneath those familiar routines, I noticed something I had ignored for years. Once I stopped viewing Jason through the lens of family obligation, certain patterns became impossible to miss. Laura called me on Tuesday evening. She wanted to confirm details about the birthday celebration. The guest list had grown. The venue had been upgraded. The menu had changed twice. I listened patiently while she described every detail. Then she mentioned the cost. Jason wanted something memorable, she said. I smiled to myself. Memorable was one word for it. Expensive was another. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a while. The conversation reminded me of a dinner several months earlier. Jason had spent nearly 20 minutes discussing luxury watches. He described limited editions, collector markets, and investment value. At the time, I barely paid attention. Now I remembered something else. He never once spoke about craftsmanship. He never spoke about history. He never spoke about why an object mattered, only what it cost. That distinction stayed with me. 2 days later, Emma stopped by unexpectedly. She arrived carrying a paper bag filled with pastries from a local bakery. We sat together at the kitchen table and shared coffee. Unlike most people her age, Emma never seemed distracted when she visited. She listened carefully. She asked questions. She remembered details from conversations that happened years earlier. At one point, her eyes drifted toward the walnut box resting on a shelf in the dining room. "Grandpa's box?" she asked. I nodded. "It still looks exactly the same." Her smile softened. "I always loved that thing." We spent nearly an hour talking about Richard. Not money, not property, not inheritance, just memories, stories, moments. When Emma finally left, I stood at the front door watching her drive away. A thought crossed my mind then. Character reveals itself most clearly when there is nothing to gain. Emma never asked about my finances. She never hinted at future expectations. She valued people before possessions. Richard would have admired that. As Saturday approached, preparations for the celebration became impossible to ignore. Social media filled with photographs of decorations being delivered. Friends posted messages about attending. Laura called twice more. Jason apparently wanted everything perfect. The irony did not escape me. Someone can spend thousands of dollars creating the appearance of importance while completely overlooking the people who helped build their life. On the morning of the event, I opened the walnut box one final time. The pocket watch rested exactly where I had placed it. Sunlight from the kitchen window reflected softly against the polished metal. I picked it up and listened to the steady ticking. Richard used to say that time exposed everything eventually. Good intentions, bad intentions, truth, illusion. Given enough time, people always revealed themselves. I returned the watch to its velvet lining and carefully closed the lid. Then I wrapped the box in simple paper and tied a dark blue ribbon around it. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive, just honest. Looking back now, I realized the gift was never really a test. The test had been happening for years. The birthday party merely provided the final answer. The evening after the celebration, Jason seemed happier than ever. At least that was the impression he gave everyone around him. Photographs from the event appeared online throughout the weekend. Friends commented on the venue, the food, and the decorations. Business associates congratulated him. Family members shared pictures of smiling faces gathered beneath crystal chandeliers. Looking at those images, nobody would have guessed that the most important thing connected to that night had happened quietly and months before any photograph was taken. Monday morning arrived, and life resumed its usual rhythm. I spent several hours tending the garden behind my house. The weather remained mild for early autumn. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of fallen leaves across the yard. Around noon, Laura called. Her voice sounded cheerful. She told me how much everyone enjoyed the party. She mentioned that several guests were still talking about it. Then she laughed about how ambitious Jason had become since receiving praise from his friends and colleagues. "He is already planning the next big project," she said. "You know how he is." I knew exactly how he was. Confidence came easily when someone believed the future had already been secured. Later that week, I attended a family lunch at a restaurant near downtown Hartford. The gathering was casual, nothing special, just a chance for several relatives to catch up. Jason spent much of the meal discussing real estate investments. He spoke confidently about market trends, renovation opportunities, and long-term wealth strategies. Most people listened politely. Some seemed impressed. I noticed something else. Every time the conversation drifted toward family, memories, or personal experiences, his interest faded. But whenever money entered the discussion, his attention sharpened immediately. Near the end of the meal, one of my cousins asked whether I had plans to downsize. It was a reasonable question. Many people my age eventually move into smaller homes. Before I could answer, Jason smiled. "That house is worth a fortune now," he said. "Properties like that do not stay in one family forever." The remark sounded harmless on the surface. Nobody reacted. Yet I remembered the conversation from the barbecue. I remembered the certainty in his voice. Once again, I saw the same assumption hiding beneath his words. The house was not a home in his eyes. It was an asset waiting to change hands. That realization no longer upset me. Instead, it confirmed that I had made the right decision. A few days later, Emma visited again. We spent the afternoon organizing old family photographs. Boxes filled with decades of memories covered the dining room table. Vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, school events. Emma handled every photograph carefully. She asked questions about people she had never met. She wanted to know their stories. At one point, she found a picture of Richard standing beside the first company truck he ever purchased. The truck looked worn and outdated by modern standards. Emma smiled. "Grandpa looks proud." I said. "He worked very hard for that truck." She studied the photograph for another moment. "He built something real." Her words stayed with me long after she left. Real. That was the difference. Richard built relationships, memories, trust. Those things lasted longer than any account balance. Meanwhile, somewhere across town, Jason continued making plans for a future he believed belonged to him. He remained completely unaware that the foundation beneath those expectations had already disappeared. As October settled over Connecticut, the trees surrounding my neighborhood transformed into shades of gold, amber, and deep red. The season had always been Richard's favorite. He used to spend Saturday mornings driving through the countryside simply to admire the changing leaves. That year, I found myself thinking about him more often, not because I was lonely, but because certain moments made me wonder what he would have said about everything that had happened. I suspected his response would have been simple. He always believed that respect mattered more than appearances. One afternoon, Emma invited me to attend a small community event at her college. Students were presenting projects and volunteering with local organizations. It was nothing extravagant, no fancy decorations, no expensive venue, just people contributing their time and effort to causes they cared about. I spent nearly 3 hours walking from table to table beside her. Everywhere we went, students greeted her warmly. Professors stopped to speak with her. Volunteers thanked her for helping organize several programs throughout the semester. Watching her interact with others reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. Character creates a reputation that money cannot buy. On the drive home, Emma told me about a scholarship fund that helped students facing financial difficulties. She spoke passionately about the impact even small contributions could make. There was no performance in her voice, no attempt to impress anyone. She simply cared. Later that evening, after she dropped me off, I sat in the living room and reflected on our conversation. My thoughts drifted back to countless family gatherings over the years. I remembered who showed up when Richard was recovering from surgery. I remembered who called during difficult times. I remembered who offered help without expecting anything in return. Those memories revealed more about people than any conversation about wealth ever could. A few days later, Laura visited unexpectedly. We shared lunch at the kitchen table. For a while, everything felt normal. Then the conversation shifted toward future plans, renovations, investments, property values. The subjects seemed to appear more frequently these days. Laura mentioned that Jason had been researching waterfront homes. She laughed and said he was always thinking ahead. I smiled politely, but something caught my attention. Every future plan she described assumed growth, acquisition, and expansion. Bigger houses, larger investments, more assets. Nobody seemed to discuss gratitude for what already existed. After Laura left, I walked through the rooms of my house. Family photographs lined the hallway walls. Richard's books remained on the shelves. Memories filled every corner. This place represented a lifetime, not a financial opportunity. Standing there, I realized that some people inherit possessions while others inherit values. The second gift is far more important. During the following week, Thomas Reed called to confirm that all estate documents had been finalized and properly filed. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. When I hung up, I felt completely at peace. There was nothing left to reconsider, nothing left to debate. The decision reflected reality as I understood it. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. Jason remained confident. Emma remained kind. Laura remained caught somewhere between the two. And although none of them knew it yet, a day was approaching when assumptions would finally collide with truth. Nearly 2 months passed before the moment arrived. By then, Thanksgiving decorations had begun appearing throughout town. Store windows displayed wreaths and lights. Neighbors hung garlands across porches. The holiday season always encouraged reflection, and perhaps that was why I finally decided it was time to gather the family. I called Laura first, then Emma. A few close relatives received invitations as well. I explained that I wanted everyone together for an important discussion about future planning. Nothing more, nothing less. The meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon at my house. When the day arrived, the weather was cold but clear. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, illuminating the living room where Richard and I had hosted countless family gatherings over the years. I arranged coffee, tea, and light refreshments on the dining room table. Everything felt calm, ordinary. Around 1 o'clock, people began arriving. Emma came first. She hugged me and offered to help in the kitchen. Shortly afterward, Laura and Jason walked through the front door. Jason appeared relaxed, confident. He greeted everyone warmly and settled into a chair near the fireplace. Watching him, I could tell he believed this gathering would be routine. Perhaps he expected a discussion about investments or property maintenance. Perhaps he assumed it was another opportunity to look toward the future he had already imagined for himself. At exactly 1:30, Thomas Reed arrived carrying a leather briefcase. The moment he entered the room, several people exchanged curious glances. Jason looked surprised but not concerned. Thomas greeted everyone politely and took a seat beside me. Conversations gradually faded. Coffee cups settled onto tables. The room grew quiet. Thomas opened his briefcase and removed several documents. Evelyn asked me to attend today because she wanted certain family matters clarified, he said calmly. Nobody spoke. Laura glanced toward me. Emma remained attentive. Jason leaned back comfortably in his chair. Thomas continued explaining the importance of estate planning and keeping legal documents updated as circumstances changed. His voice remained steady and professional. Then he began reviewing the current structure of my estate. The house, the investment accounts, the charitable contributions. Everything was presented clearly. Jason listened with obvious interest. Occasionally he nodded as though hearing information he already expected. Then Thomas reached the section describing beneficiary designations. I watched the room carefully. One by one, names were mentioned. Allocations were explained. Plans were outlined. And then something unusual happened. The name Jason expected to hear never appeared. At first he seemed confused. He frowned slightly and shifted in his chair. Thomas continued reading. Still nothing. The confusion slowly transformed into disbelief. Finally, Jason interrupted. "Wait a second," he said. "I think something got skipped." The room became completely silent. Thomas looked down at the document and then back at Jason. "Nothing was skipped," he replied. Jason stared at him. "What do you mean?" Thomas answered with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the meeting. "The estate plan was revised several months ago." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Laura looked from Thomas to me. Emma remained perfectly still. Jason's confident expression disappeared for the first time since I had known him. The future he believed was guaranteed had vanished with a single sentence. And for the first time, he realized he had never actually understood the woman sitting quietly across the room. For several seconds after Thomas spoke, nobody said a word. The silence seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Jason stared at the documents in disbelief. He looked at Thomas, then at me, then back at Thomas again. "There has to be some mistake," he finally said. Thomas remained calm. "There is no mistake." Laura shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Mom?" she asked softly. I met her eyes and offered a small smile. Not a triumphant smile, not an angry one. Simply the smile of someone who had already made peace with a difficult decision. Jason leaned forward. "When did this happen?" he asked. "Several months ago," Thomas replied. The answer seemed to hit him harder than anything else. Several months. Long before that birthday party. Long before the jokes. Long before he believed everything was proceeding exactly as expected. His expression changed as he began replaying events in his own mind. I could almost see the realization forming. The confidence he carried for years had been based on assumptions, not facts. "Why?" he asked. The room grew quiet again. This time Thomas looked toward me. The question belonged to me alone. I folded my hands together and took a slow breath. "Because inheritance is about trust," I said. Nobody interrupted. "Your name was never removed because of money." Jason stared at me. "Then why?" he repeated. "I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the country club. I thought about dozens of small moments spread across years. None of them dramatic. None of them worthy of a confrontation on their own. Yet together they told a story. Because over time, you showed me exactly how you viewed me, I said quietly. You saw my life as a future transaction. You saw what Richard and I built as something waiting to be collected. Jason immediately shook his head. That is not true. I did not argue. There was no point. People rarely recognize themselves in the mirror when they dislike the reflection. You are entitled to your opinion, I said. But I made my decision based on what I experienced. Nobody spoke. The room remained perfectly still. Then Emma reached across the space between us and gently placed her hand over mine. It was a simple gesture, yet it reminded me why I felt so certain. Character reveals itself in small moments. Kindness reveals itself in small moments too. Thomas continued reviewing the remaining details of the estate plan. A significant portion would support several charitable organizations Richard and I had cared about for years. Other portions would remain within the family according to the revised structure. Everything had been carefully considered. Everything reflected values rather than expectations. When the meeting finally ended, relatives slowly gathered their coats and belongings. Conversations were subdued. Some people appeared surprised, others thoughtful. Jason said very little. Laura seemed overwhelmed, but not angry. Emma hugged me before helping clear the coffee cups from the table. As the house gradually emptied, I walked to the front window and looked outside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. For a moment, I thought about Richard's old pocket watch resting safely inside its walnut box. Time exposes everything eventually. He had always been right about that. I did not feel victorious standing there. Victory was never the goal. What I felt was freedom. Freedom from expectations that never belonged to me. Freedom from pretending not to notice what had been obvious for years. Most importantly, freedom to ensure that everything Richard and I built would reflect the values that built it. And as the last car disappeared down the street, I realized something unexpected. The greatest inheritance we leave behind is not money. It is the lesson that respect must always come before reward.